Hi, everyone. This is Raquel.
Hi, and this is Jennifer.
Welcome to Madness Cafe.
This is a feminist podcast where we talk about women's issues, politics, and health and wellness.
And where those issues intersect. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Madness Cafe. Today, Jennifer and I have two guests with us today. So we're very excited. This is a special occasion. And we're going to talk about this book right here. But let me just give you guys a little overview, and we'll lead into the introduction of our guest today. For 20 years, the New York City-based spoken word group Poetic People Power, which is also where this book comes from, has creatively explored social and political topics, offering insights and solutions to issues that affect our everyday lives and the world around us. This debut anthology invites readers to explore 3 of their shows about environmental heroes, women's voices, and human rights abuses. Tara Bracco is the founder and producing artistic director of Poetic People Power. She has created, produced, and performed in 20 spoken word shows about social and political issues. She is a recognized leader in the field of art and social change and has been featured in the Oprah Magazine, Time Out New York, Brooklyn Rail, and HuffPost. As a journalist, her work has appeared in Cosmopolitan, American Theater, Condé Nast Traveler, Bust, and Clamor. Our other guest, Karla Jackson-Brewer, is a longtime member of Poetic People Power. She's a professor at Rutgers University, a senior Vajrayana Buddhist teacher, and priest in the West African tradition of Ifa. Ladies, welcome to Madness Cafe. We're so excited to talk to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yay!
Good to be here.
I think the first question today would be, can you tell us a little bit about yourselves? This is a big question, actually, how you came to work on this project and how you came to work on it together. It's a big question.
So to back up a little bit for me, I think as a young person, I was always interested in writing and reading, but more so trying to figure out the world around me through writing and journaling. I was searching books for how I was going to navigate life, and I was pulling out quotes, and I was a pretty much a serious young kid in that way. So I feel like for me, even as a child, I was writing poetry. And I was also writing songs, but I didn't have any musical ability. So I really ended up with a bunch of poems as a young person. And then my writing continued, and I studied theater in undergrad, and during high school, I trained with Circle Rep. And so I was very much interested in storytelling and the power of connection that comes through storytelling. And the thing that I liked about theater too, I shouldn't say more than writing, but something that drew me to it was the collective work with people as a team on something. When I got out of college, I was really then trying to figure out what kind of writer I was going to be. And I went on a self-funded cross-country poetry tour at the time, just
Wow.
traveling with a backpack through bus and train for about 2 months across the country, going to major cities. And back then, opening the equivalent of what was the Village Voice in those places, the local paper, and going to open mics. And they didn't have a lot of feature poets at that time. The world, the literary world in terms of poetry back then, very much seemed to be slam poetry or literary poetry. And I really didn't feel like that was a fit for me. My performance nature didn't fit into the literary poetry world, and I didn't like the slam aspects where people were graded or people were performing or a grade or to be elevated in a competitive kind of way. So I did this poetry tour, and it really allowed me to see just the range of poetic voices that were out there. And I came back to New York, and I had a part-time job working for the feminist writer Erica Jong, which was very instrumental in me starting to think about feminism more than I had a theater background, but not so much a women's studies background. So I say that working for Erica was almost like getting a master's degree in feminism. because I would
Nice.
found all these books and I didn't know who these feminist writers were. So I would read a book a week. I would
Mhm.
take notes from something I saw on her bookshelf, and then I'd go to the library and get a book. And that was in the late 90s. Around that time, I think it was Random House came out with a list of the 100 best books of the century, and
Mm,
only 8 or 9 female novelists on it. Um,
Wow.
these were novels, 100 best
yeah.
novels. So Erica was putting together an alternative list of the best novels by women of the century. And so I was in the office at that time where we were getting faxes from Toni Morrison and Joyce Maynard, and we were collecting and doing the grading of what was rising to the top for people as the best stories. So that was really my early introduction to thinking about writing more seriously, and this idea that women could have a voice as a writer in our society. And that was a big deal for me. My parents were teachers, so I didn't have access to this kind of thinking or that process. I think something I always like to share about the early days of, we call Poetic People Power P3. So what I like to share about the early days of P3 is it's hard to remember now when we can do this podcast that there was a time when we didn't have these platforms where people
Right.
had, where the world was very, even media, right? There were certain people who worked in media and there were gatekeepers around who got access to media, who got on television, who got book deals, who didn't. And so P3 was really formed in a time where I was concerned as a young feminist how we were really going to give voice and how I was going to be an activist as I got older. What was going to encourage me to keep learning about the world around me, right?
Mm,
Because the news reports what's already happened. But if
yeah.
you understand the analysis of the political topics around you, then you really have to look for other kind of content. So how was I going to do that? And my goal then was to put it all together. So I was thinking about all these pieces, and I went on to, after I worked for Erica, I worked for a women's theater company. It was called Women's Projects and Productions. It's now called WP Theater. It was the oldest and largest women's theater in the country, an off-Broadway theater
Wow.
founded by Julia Miles, and I worked under Julia Miles for 5 years, and she was a real mentor to me. So then I got to see how shows are put together, piecing all these elements together. How can we encourage poets who don't really fit into the what's happening out there at the time, slam and literary world? How can we give
Hmm.
them voice? How can we encourage them with some paid opportunities, with a commission? In the writing world, you're commissioned to write something maybe for a magazine. A theater company might commission a playwright to write something. But in the poetry world, it's like you're lucky if you get published, you're lucky if you get paid. So how
Hmm.
do we cultivate this talent? And so I was thinking about all those pieces as I put together Poetic People Power. So I'll stop there.
There's a lot in there, but
Yeah.
Karla, do you want to kind of give us your background?
Sure, it's great that you went first, Tara, because it reminded me, I keep thinking like, well, when did I start writing? When was I interested in this? And so I was a really avid reader as a young person, and I love novels. I still love novels. So I love stories. And then I realized that in my education, my early elementary school education, I actually learned to write by having to write a composition every week. So I went to school where we had to write a composition, and we were given a prompt, a title, and we had to do 350 words or 500 words, which definitely got my creative juices flowing. And then I look back, high school, I think a lot of my writing was based on emotion, really using poetry to say things that I couldn't actually say, that I might not have even been able to name. So I look back at some of that poetry I found, it's like, oh my gosh, poor baby. I was trying to figure out the world, but it's like, oh, let me escape, right? So I call that my escape period. I did some writing in college, and I did some writing afterwards. So like 70s, 80s. And then I had children. And having children and also like maintaining jobs and the double day. My
Mhm.
writing was limited more to little snippets of things. Then I also think about my activism. So in the 1980s, actually in the late 70s, I was very much involved in a community mental health center. That's where I
Mm.
was employed, but I was doing community education. So community education around mental health and around early intervention and really helping people to address what might be like a hiccup or some momentary problem that with an intervention could be resolved and then folks can move on. In the 80s, I began to do a lot of education around sexual assault. And that's where my activism really, I was the chair of the board of New York Women Against Rape for a really long time. I did a lot of training of counselors, rape crisis counselors. I did a lot of training of therapists to help people understand, because at that time, people were still operating from such mythology around
Mhm.
sexual assault.
They
And then
still
I went
are.
out into yes, they are. It's so frustrating for me. And then I went into the community and helped people understand, well, no, these are myths. Here's the reality. So mixing that activism and then really advocating very much for women and children and how I came to peace. Three, for Women's Leadership Institute, the Woodhull Institute for Ethical Leadership. And went to a show at the Bowery Poetry Club. And I was so inspired by the writers that I pulled out some receipts out of my pocketbook. And during the intermission, I started writing, just pouring out this poetry. I shared that with Tara, and then in a very short period of time, she invited me and commissioned me to write for one of the shows. And that's how I became involved. You know, in terms of P3, what I love about P3 is the collaboration. Like you talked about, poetry slams and the competition.
Mm.
There's no real competition among us, which is, it's unique. It's unique, and we find appreciation for everybody's pieces, even though the styles are distinctly different. So that gives you a little bit of my trajectory here.
I do have a question around that. Tara, you mentioned that for poetry, artists are lucky if they get published, lucky if they get paid. Karla, how did it feel to you as an artist to be commissioned?
It was like I was a grown up. I was a grown up, I was a grown up, and I felt like, oh, my work is important. My words are important. They're valuable. And
Mhm.
here's a value that's associated with them. So that was the feeling. And the feeling also was, well, no, I can't let Tara down, I
Right.
have to show up. And, no, it was distinctly different. It was so good. But that feeling like, oh, I'm a grown up. This is a piece of work.
Mhm.
And I'm getting compensation for this work. How
Yeah.
wonderful.
Wow.
How wonderful. And
Mhm.
that continues today with the program, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, we did 20 shows in 20 years, and
So
we
impressive.
the 20th anniversary in 2023. And since then, I'm in a space where we're really archiving the project. So the book is coming out. We worked on a website. We started the early sessions filming of a documentary film to tell
Oh, wow.
Yay!
a group of poets in New York
Yes.
City gathered for 20 years to change the world through poetry. We're doing things that are still part of Poetic People Power, but in terms of the annual series, I put a pause on the annual series at the 20th anniversary show because it's a lot of work for me to do on top of my day jobs and other things, and it's all volunteer. I think people get a sense of the value and the professionalism of P3 and think that it's this nonprofit that has a budget, and it's not. It's just been
Wow.
eating it,
Mhm.
doing that through volunteer work, which I think is important for our communities to do these things. And I think there are people all over the country with this kind of commitment in their communities. I know that I know some of those people. But I think I thought it was important work, and I know collectively that through the shows that we've done, it's not just feel good shows, like come to the
Yeah.
show, learn something about the environment and walk away. One of the things, even as a young person, you have to imagine that I was in my late 20s when I started this. So just thinking back to my younger self is a little bit fun for me, but I was really intentional around the idea of, well, people can't just come to these shows. They have to know what to do about these things. I just want to explain that for each year, we did a new social or political topic. So we were able to look into a theme, a new theme each year. And so that was a way for me to commission the poets about a particular theme. For instance, the water crisis, which we did in 2009. Before, there was a lot of media attention about the global water crisis. And
Mhm.
so I was able to commission poets, and part of my role as producer isn't just to put it all together, but to think about what the story is for the audience. What do we really want them to take away with them? You know, I was very intentional about like, well, let's not have 7 poems about bottled water. We're going to have, you know, a poem about water privatization as it relates to the IMF and the World Bank. We're going to have a poem about water scarcity. We're going to have a poem about bottled water, and just really letting people see the range of what that issue is. And then at the end of those shows, there are takeaways, a stay action section in the program. And even in the earlier shows, I was emceeing the shows, and I was acting as like a narrative script leading into the poems so that people could understand the issue better. The
Mm.
poems in this book are structured a little bit differently in that they're structured almost like plays, where there's a
Mhm.
opening individual scenes by each poet and then a group close. But the earlier shows were actually structured a little bit differently, where I was emceeing the show and giving pieces of information through the emceeing. But I really wanted people to come to the shows and walk away and feel like they could do something about the issue. And we've heard from audience members that people have, you know, joined newsletters and nonprofits and volunteered, changed their water habits, reduced their dependence on bottled water. One person once came to a show that we did about consumerism and then went home and just like returned $200 worth of clothing they had just bought, you know?
Wow.
And just on a personal level, after the water show, I co-founded an international nonprofit with a friend of mine that helps people in distressed areas in developing countries with water-related issues. And that organization's been going on, I think, 15 years now, and we're serving 30,000 people in 14 countries. So it's all to say, I make this point because I think people think we just do poetry shows and people maybe learn a little something or being inspired and then they just go on with their lives. And that really, where the goal was to do something much deeper and to figure out a way, if I was going to put time into this, how is everybody served by this? How is the audience?
Mhm.
How are the poets served? Right? So that we have a level of engagement. I think of like the circle, like we have a level of engagement where, the energy is very circular and it's not one directional. I love Karla's story that she was an audience member and then became a performer with the group, because to me it's not about we're the performers and you just consume or take in this performance, that it's very much about having that circular energy, that somebody in the audience could be on stage and have a voice, that we're
Mhm.
a community and this is what we're doing and sharing time and space together, which is why I felt strongly that these had to be shows in a space versus something I was just going to publish on a zine.
The way in which you helped people to be involved. It wasn't like we just performed these poems and we mentioned a few things. At the back of the program or on a card were specific links and references. So people who might be shy or not know where to begin could just directly click on a link and see how they could become much more active in a particular theme. And, I think that goes well to support that circular involvement and getting people to see that taking an action can really be a small step. and helping them do that. So that was, I think, brilliant, actually, as part of the work of P3.
Even just
Well,
build community around P3. We've had P3 members go to protests together. So we weren't just doing these one-off shows. We formed friendships that have sustained throughout the years. And I think of myself individually as a writer, but more publicly, I think of myself as a community builder, an author. Even more than a performer, I think of myself as a producer, and that my talent is really putting these things together. Even when we do something like this, I want to bring a poet with me. It's about us being in space together. I can lead the project, and I have in terms of the work, but yeah, I was more interested in doing the work together.
wow. I just have to start by saying that I am so impressed with both of you and with what y'all have accomplished. Tara, doing this at starting it at such a young age, and it's gone on for 20 plus years now, is such a huge accomplishment. And I hope you accept that. I hope you feel it and receive that, because that is enormous. And that you have built this huge community of people around this. Jennifer and I have talked before about how words are powerful and words matter. You all are using poetry as a way to talk to people and get people thinking about pretty significant topics, right? That could be considered pretty heavy. My impression is that maybe it's a little bit easier for people to take these in the way that y'all are presenting it, right? As pieces that all of the emotion and the importance comes through in poetry, and you're not beating people over the head.
And, part of me thinking about this in the early days was not just that I want to create a space for a range of voices and a range of styles, but also from an audience perspective. Like, I was very careful to make sure that we didn't have one poet who got up there and it was the total runaway train, right? These things
Mm.
very structured and very curated, and we would let the audience know up front what the show would look like. And it's almost like if somebody says something that you don't agree with, if somebody has a style that you don't like, it's going to be over in 5 minutes, right? Like, this is a space, like, and that was part of me being like, how do we really reach people with these topics? Again, like, how can we make sure all these people are served, right? And
Mhm.
it's totally okay if a poem doesn't resonate with everybody. And then we move on to something else. And I always find that I've never met an audience member who felt like something didn't work for them in any of the shows, right? Something's always landing for someone. And I think the structure of that, and I don't know how I had that insight at a young age, but the structure of thinking about that really, I think, helped the project be successful from the audience perspective, where they had a good experience. And then we built an audience that came back year after year, right? For many years, they happened in April. And at one point, we had, I don't know, I couldn't do it in April for some reason. I can't remember if I had started grad school, there was something, and we had shifted it to July, just a couple of months later. And people were reaching out to me like, what happened to your show? Are you doing a show? And we kind of built like a muscle memory for people to think about. This is an annual thing that they go to. And one person who was even attending since she was a teenager and had gone to the shows throughout the years, she said, oh, I think about it almost like a holiday. I have my family holidays. I know I'm going to have P3 each year.
Nice.
Yeah, and we were really able to build an audience, a community around that because of some of these structural decisions that were made, I think.
The book, the first one out, focuses on 3 of the events or 3 annual events. How did you choose the 3 that you picked? And how do you feel they're significant in terms of today's political climate?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I had tried to get a book published probably for 10 years. When we hit the 10-year mark, I knew that we were doing something special. And it just wasn't, no matter where I pitched it, it just wasn't landing. And so I put the idea away for a while. And then during the pandemic, we had done a couple of shows on Zoom, and there was something in 2017, we were commissioned to do a show about human rights through the International Human Rights Arts Festival. Since that was more of a festival that was going to take place in a theater. Our shows, I had rented theaters for them, which was another intentional decision around people come to a theater and they know they're going to get a program, they're going to sit down, they're going to be quiet, right? It was like a way for me to respect the poets, to rent out these spaces. So they always happened in theaters and I considered them shows. But again, they had that MC aspect to them. So the International Human Rights Arts Festival Commission was the first time that we had come together as a group to say, what I think would work structurally here is if each poet would write a scene and I'll do the opening and closing, and we'll have lights and we'll have some basic direction. And that's what we did. And so that was more stage. It was the first time we actually had stage directions for a show. We were booked in like the 8 p.m. Saturday night slot, and it was like the prime slot. We got a standing ovation. The house was packed. It was really an incredible experience. And so that was the point in which the structure changed a little bit. And so over the next two shows, we structured them similarly. And then it made sense not only to publish these shows because they were the most recent and more timely in that regard, but also they were structured similarly. The reader could have a consistent experience in that regard. So that's how that decision was made.
And how do you feel that the three are in there are reflecting what's going on politically now? And either one of you could speak to that.
I want to jump in. Clearly, looking at our show on human rights, right? And clearly, that's evident in the world today. People are suffering in such dramatic, horrible ways on every continent, right? And the way in which women's rights are not being seen as human rights. Certain people are being seen as people, others not, demonized, objectified. So that's happening. If we look at, eco-rise, look what's happening. Look what's happening with our food. Look what's happening with climate. So it's a way to come at climate change in terms of how many different ways we are currently being affected. This is not just 2032 or 2050. This is now. And can you hear me now? I kind of feel like I'm in a bad B movie, science fiction movie. And I'm the person saying, hello, can you hear me? Can you see me? Is anybody else witnessing what's going on?
Yeah.
Because I'm just witnessing what's going on, and it's confounding. I'm like, wow, lying, like boldface lying, has become the way to be. Why have I been telling the truth? What's wrong with me? It's just confounding. So I think that each one of these shows speaks very directly to what's happening right now.
And Can You Hear Me Now really focuses on women's voices now. And you wrote a piece for that show. Would you be willing to read that or part of that for us?
I'd love to read it. And again, here we have Tara comes up with a great theme, and we each were assigned a word. And so my word was protest.
Protest.
Okay. Protest. I protest for humanity. I protest anti-Blackness. I protest state violence. I protest for change. Protest. An action not in agreement with your plan. Resistance to the status quo. Going against the grain. A work slowed down. I disagree. Shut it down. No. A simple two-letter word spoken at 2 years old turns into a banshee's wail. No! Pure power. At 7 months, you meet the boundary. My mouth clamps shut, refusing that grayish glob on the spoon, passing itself off as something nutritious. At 3 years old, you meet the power of my silent protest. I sit down on the sidewalk. I will walk no more. Passive, active protest. Protest is in my DNA from the time my ancestors arrived on this land. They found ways to outwit oppression in protest. 1776, she walks into the woods at the edge of a plantation, not allowed to leave the property, body bound to that specific land. Yet, there it is just across the road, teasing her, right beyond her grasp. She's compelled, driven by an urge so primal and transgressive, she will risk slave patrols and whips to find it. Emerald green leaves with ridges and patterns, delicate bursting lilac flowers resting against green background, fragrant and fresh. Pennyroyal, good for a cold, good to bring on the blood flow. When it's stopped by an unwanted seed of massa, sharing herbs and tea with others, she chooses. Hard choice. No more life added to increase the wealth of this southern planter. Massa ponders. For over 2 years, no children been born here. He think we stupid. Pennyroyal protest undermines his wealth.
Wow.
And then the rest of the poem goes through different time periods and different women who resisted. We focus on Ida B. Wells, looking at Ella Baker.
I just wanted to share that the show Can You Hear Me Now is a commission through Snug Harbor, a cultural center on Staten Island, through Susan Grable. And she had called me probably sometime maybe late 2019, early 2020. I have a friend, Martha, who works at Snug Harbor, and they were going to do an art exhibit with women artists aligned with the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote. And performance to open that exhibit, something that they could do for the public. And so this was before we were in a pandemic. And so then put the show together and do it over Zoom. But Susan called me and wanted to give us this commission. And within 10 minutes after I said yes to her, I hung up the phone, and the thing that I heard in my head was, "Can you hear me now?" And putting a show together about women's voices and the way women are heard from the private to the national stage to the voting booth. And so I chose these words: write, speak, sing, advocate, protest, vote. And I commissioned each poet to write a poem on those words and encourage them to use the piece to call up and honor the women who have come before them. So there was a bit of an assignment in that regards, some directive around like having some of these common pieces throughout so that the pieces would come together and make sense in that way. But each of the pieces are personal for each poet, and they get to really reflect on the women who have come before them, what it meant to them, and then what those words mean in their lives now.
Again, I'm just so impressed with both of you and your talent and the talent of all of the poets who are included, as well as I'm sure poets who weren't included in this, all of the poets that you all have worked with. There was a part in this particular piece, in your piece, Karla, that I put a star next to, and it was the part where you get to where you're talking about Ella Baker. And I'm just so impressed with the strength and the import and the depth that poets bring to such a succinct art form. And I would love it if you would talk a little bit first you, Karla, and then Tara, about how you go through that process of there's this word or a theme that you have to write about, and then you distill it and then put it into such a succinct way and have so much power behind it.
Well, as you asked that question, all of a sudden I got a little chill because, sometimes I'm not so sure it's just me writing. And that may sound a little,
No, no, it
but
makes
we
sense.
love the woo woo.
Yeah,
We
no, it
love
totally
it.
makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it really, I get this. So, of course, my process often is, okay, I got to write this poem. Oh, let me do the dishes. But I now know what's happening for me is things gestate in me.
Mhm.
Thoughts come through, and they're not even thoughts. It's almost like there's a percolation happening, and I sit down and I start writing. And so I started with this ancestor, this woman who is terminating a pregnancy because she recognizes her pivotal role, right? And then it's like, well, where do we go from there? So Tara has often commented, I kind of do this year by year thing in a lot of my poems. I just kind of locate a time period. And maybe that's how I think about things. So then it's like, okay, then we move through and we move through the 20th century and who, Ella Baker and her power and her. So all of these women, even Ida B. Wells, they're fearless. Now, did they have fear? Of course, but they continued to take the action. And that always impresses me. That somebody, no matter what the consequences, and really, Ella seems a little bit of a thing, traveling across the country, and really just inspiring people. So, she comes out and she speaks to me, and then it's like writing, and often it's, Tara says, the thought came in her mind. If the words just keep coming out on the page. And then there's a little bit of an editing process, right? Tighten this up, remove this word. Oh, that's a more powerful. So I think in terms of this succinct kind of presentation, that's where the editing is. And what helps is that we collectively get together and read our drafts.
Mm.
And other poets give us feedback. And we can do with the feedback what we will. And people are very clear and people are very kind. So we learn how to do compassionate feedback. And it often is, oh, I think if you move this piece here, it will be, oh my gosh, it's so much more powerful, or place this over. So there's a way in which we reflect back to each other. Okay, this is how this lands on me. And that helps with the sort of moving, cutting.
Wow.
So that's a little bit of my process.
Wow.
I think for me, the writing process is the way that we honor ourselves. Mentioned she tends to think in a very historical way, and so her poems have these timelines, and she places us throughout time in her pieces, and that is just uniquely Karla. And I think that as we do this work, that to accept where you are as a writer is really to honor yourself. So I, as a young person, even, I write this in one of the poems in the book about how I began writing. I would wake up in my childhood bedroom and write these fragments of words on pieces of paper in the middle of the night, just hoping I could read them the morning after, right? And so I was always thinking in these fragments and trying to put words together almost as if they were puzzle pieces. How do you place one word here versus here? What happens? Is this the right word? It was this very exploratory way with words, but was really an exploratory process for who I am. And so that's why I say to honor the writing process is to honor yourself and to honor who you are in the way that you just think uniquely, compared to someone else. And I think that there's real beauty in that.
There really is.
Yeah.
Yeah, there really is. Somewhere in your book, you mentioned that you were told art shouldn't be political.
Oh, yeah.
Mm.
Agree, disagree? I'm pretty sure you disagree.
When I started this, I started this in response to the Iraq War. There was a Poets Against the War movement happening in 2003, and I decided I'm going to put together a bunch of women poets, and we're going to, do poems as part of the Poets Against the War movement. And then poets asked me to keep doing those shows, and I thought, well, if I keep doing them, I'm going to get burnt out. So I'll just look at doing a show a year with these new topics. And that's really how it came into being. But in those early days, people really said like this, they didn't believe that the work couldn't be didactic. They really felt like there's, no way this is going to be good. And what was interesting to me about that is that we were living in a time where a majority of the people really weren't negatively affected by these issues the way
Yeah.
are now. Like we are in a time where, back then we could really see the corporatization of the country. And we did a show many years ago around called Raise the Wage. And we talked back then about the CEO pay and how it was getting out of control. And we talked back then about how housing prices were going up and how I think that was the first, when we did that show, that was the first year on record that somebody earning a minimum wage couldn't afford a one-bedroom apartment, right? So
Wow.
you're starting to see these things happening. And as an activist, as somebody who cared about writing, and then I went on to study journalism, I was just in a space of listening, right? And so people often say, they're like, you had a crystal ball because I did so many topics before they were press. We did global warming before Al Gore's movie. We did, a show about revolution 6 months before Occupy Wall Street, universal health care before Obama was elected. I didn't have a crystal ball. I was just in tune to how people were experiencing what was actually happening to them. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then these things really did blow up, socially and politically in that way. But back then, I felt like when people said that, I definitely had resistance and a bit of anger to that because I'm like, that's a privileged position. If you don't have a story about how healthcare is negatively impacting your family, then you're in a really privileged position. Because we did the healthcare show and people came up to me privately, quietly to tell me their family had almost had to file for bankruptcy because of medical debt. Right. So back then when we were doing that show, these were really seen as personal problems. You can't solve this, and it's a personal problem. And I was seeing them as political and national issues. I was seeing them within the context, the greater context that had to be spoken about. I was annoyed when people would say that, and especially when people would say, well, we shouldn't write on these topics or they shouldn't be commissioned. People should just feel what they feel and write from that feeling. And what I would say to people if there was resistance is, here's the topic, look into it. You're going to feel something because
Mm-hmm.
justice will not allow you not to feel, and you'll be able to write about it once you feel that injustice. If there's a child who has to die of a brain tumor because the family can't afford the coverage or the health insurance or the surgery, I mean, how do you not have a feeling about that? Right. And so for me, I think back then people really thought of these things as over there, as a segmented thing that wasn't, and that's totally different now. And it's so great when I see on social media people really connecting the dots, because in the early days of doing this work, there was really a sense of like, well, why are you talking about this? Like, why are you doing art about this? This is not what art should look like. And I just felt like, if then you are really privileged if you don't understand the impact of these issues and how they're playing out on people's lives.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Well,
not only privileged, but in so many ways, you're in denial.
yeah.
Mm.
Because now what we're seeing is that no, things are even touching some of those who are on the border of privilege, right?
Yeah.
So, really paying attention to how, I mean, for me, the dots are easy to connect. If you deny people health care, they get ill. What makes you think that their illness will not impact you?
Mm-hmm.
So it's in if you wanted to operate out of self-interest,
Yeah.
everyone should have access to healthcare, right?
Absolutely.
It's so obvious. So this idea that, oh no, or certain writing shouldn't be political or this should, that's bullshit. So I'll be the first one to curse.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just is. It just is because really everything is political. All things have
Yeah.
political elements.
Well, and when you think about it, art is a form of protest and always has been. And, you know, looking back, the voice of the people has been presented in many ways, but in art as one really powerful way. And when there's, you know, governments that are, you know, authoritarian and cracking down on people and rights, art is always
Yes.
pushed down on, right? So art is definitely a form of protest, and it's voicing what's going on with the people.
And it really has an ability to connect with people without, telling them exactly what to believe, how to think, how to be in the world. And I think that's really powerful. And I think that, more so than just an op-ed or a journalistic news story, the creativeness and the ability to connect through story and to people's heart is really the thing that changes behavior.
It's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Really can use art for social change. I don't think their change is much merely by fact, right? It's a fact.
Yeah.
It's dry, it doesn't land the way. They're changed by storytelling, a sense of connection, and all that comes with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love that you say at the end of the book, art plus action equals change. What art will you make? What action will you take?
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Yeah, that's something I came up with where, it was just one of those things where it came to me, and then we started closing our shows with that as a group saying it. And also a call back to the audience, right? So
Mm-hmm.
they're not just going to perform for you, that this is a participatory process for all of us.
So the book continues to be an amazingly powerful book. I'm not one who always understands poetry, and I delved into this and I was touched. I was moved. I actually understood the poetry. And I feel also that the guide at the back gives a lot of information that's hopeful, places
Mm-hmm.
people can go, resources. All that being said, the book is so great. We could take something out of every page and ask you a question about it, but we're running out of time. So is there anything that you wanted to say to the audience, each of you, that we didn't give you the opportunity to do?
What I would want to say to the audience is to tap into your creativity. We all have creative energy, and the creative energy makes our lives more beautiful, helps us connect. Own it, share it, play with it.
I love that.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
In addition to the book, amplifying the great voices of the poets who have been part of this project, that it can really just serve as a reminder of what all of us can do in our communities, how we creatively, collaboratively, and really work towards change.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you
Thank
to
you.
both of you. It's just so powerful. And the two of you have touched so many people with the work that you've done and continue to do. And with your writing and the shows, you've had an amazing ripple effect with all of the people that you've touched and the people that they go on to touch. So thank you for all of this and sharing it with all of us.
Thank you for letting us be here.
Yes, thank you so much.
Do you want to
I'm-
recap?
You know, like I said at the beginning, I'm so impressed at how much emotion and information and power is presented in such a succinct way. And there's so much that I learned in these poems that I probably wouldn't have come into contact with. The fact that there's so many different viewpoints and voices and backgrounds that are represented in this book, I mean, it just makes me think about, and we've talked about this before, about how, in school we're taught about poetry, but it's, a bunch of dead white guys, right?
I don't even understand that poetry.
Right.
Like, they read it and I'm like, what does that mean? I don't even know what that means.
Exactly.
This, I know what it means.
Right. Because this is real people talking, right?
About
This
real
is
issues.
about real issues, about things that are impacting their lives, impacting their communities, impacting the world. And it's showing how we're all interconnected and how we all have a voice and we can put our experiences out there in a way that touches other people. If we had been taught about poetry this way
I would have
in
read
high
it.
school, yeah, we would have read more of it probably. We probably would have developed a love for it and an understanding of it in a way that we just don't. And I'm not saying we shouldn't learn, all the classics and all those things. Yeah, we definitely should. But then to see that art is of the people too. It's not just these people that we hold up as a standard.
And contemporary.
Exactly. Yes.
And Raquel, that poem that Karla wrote,
Mhm.
Protest,
Mm-hmm.
it's really interesting that you starred that part. Will you read that part that you starred? I want to see if it's the same part that I marked.
Right. And it's the part about Ella Baker, and I kind of skipped a few parts, but I'll read the pieces that I underlined, because I think even just those lines, I think it still flows together really well, and it still, at least for me, still has an impact.
Okay.
But starting on page 72 and then going over to page 73, in protest, we take our chances with our men. Remember who you are, Black women. Remember, you have power. Her deep, resonant voice, heard as a challenge, bruising Black male preacher egos. She doesn't defer to male authority.
I love it so much. This is such an amazing poem. And it is so, okay, I don't remember when this was written, but it's so timely.
Mm-hmm.
Even the pennyroyal protest,
Yes.
undermining his wealth.
Yes.
It's exactly what we talked about in the podcast that we had about my so-called selfish life.
Yes.
When we talked about forced birthers versus choosing not to be a mother,
Mm-hmm.
and how our history has forced women to do one or the other.
Yeah.
And I also do clearly see the power in this of being a Black woman as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, I practically underlined that whole poem.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And then it goes on further under pennyroyal protest. And this is the part that I underlined, that I just, so much in this book just hit me a certain way, but this was another part that was just really specific. It says, protesting the veiling of the truth, she is fired, freed. She uses the written word denied to her ancestors. She uses the written word to reveal what is only shared in whispers.
Oh, it's so good. See, I would have read poetry in high school if it was written like this.
Right. I mean, damn, like the emotion in this, like, how do you not read these words?
Right.
And just feel all of it. And the other poems that are in here too, like, can you hear me now? I'm an activist. Can you hear me now? I'm a, like, Just
Yes.
so good. So good.
I want to read one more piece, just a
Yeah.
really short thing that spoke to me. This is from the Echo Rise, which is another what am I trying to say?
Another show in the
It's just
in the piece.
another specific title, but I just love this. It's from a poem called Wasserman Wars with the Wind, but it's on
I loved that one.
It's on page 10, way at the bottom. It says, men like Donald Trump Jr. laugh at the idea that air can be racist, that air can kill. And yet here were neighborhoods of people dying, being told their deaths were an inconvenient truth. That's another one that I'm like, this is so timely today.
Right.
And
all of it.
And the fight over whether that's a human's right issue, whether it's a racism issue, whether it's a we're killing our freaking planet issue, but it really affects people in different neighborhoods so much more. I just love this book. I can't say. I wish I could have gone to see the shows.
Oh, I know.
Can't wait for the documentary.
I was just gonna say that. Oh my God. Oh my God. I can't wait. It's so powerful and so wrought with emotion and information and a call to action. I mean, literally every word on the page is a call to action.
And it's such a positive, it sounds like, oh, they're human rights issues and it's so sad. And yes, it is. It's very serious issues, but there's so much positivity about it. Like where we've come, where we're going, people building community, people standing together, and then also stay active. There's this whole part in the back of the book. And so if you're looking at Can You Hear Me Now, it gives all these: register to vote, rock the vote, League of Women Voters, Emily's List, National Organization for Women, National Women's Law Center, Equality Now, American Civil Liberties Union, Black Lives Matter, Native Women's Wilderness, Malala Fund, A Room of Her Own Foundation, Feminist Press, Fuller Project, Women's E-News, Ms. Magazine, Bitch Magazine, WP Theater. So many resources for people to get involved in a way that fits with their lifestyle.
Exactly. There is a way for everyone to be part of the change. Not everyone has to do the same thing. There are so many ways for people to be involved in change. Just like you said, it's such a positive, hopeful message. Art is power. Art is power. Art must be supported. Art is more than just words on a page. It's words on a page that empower people and inspire people. I'm
inspired.
Same. And I'm in awe of all of the amount of talent that is collected here and the amount of talent that is alluded to that didn't get included. I can't wait for the documentary. I can't wait to know more about this. People, please read the book, explore poetry, explore issues that you didn't think you would have a connection to. We're all connected and we all can do something about it. Thanks everyone for listening today. We will be back with more Madness Cafe next week. You can find us on Instagram at Madness Cafe Podcast or email us at madnesscafepodcast@gmail.com. Bye.